Hello, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. Thank you all for joining. I'm Cassie Palson from the marketing team here at Unit21. Really excited to have this expert panel joining us. We've heard a lot about in the industry kind of the why and the why now of AI, but I'm really excited because this discussion is going to go deep into kind of the how to get it done from a regulatory perspective, governance perspective. So I'm just going to cover a few logistics and then hand it over because I think it's going to be a jam-packed discussion. So if you guys are having any technical issues, at the bottom of this page, you can scroll down and see an FAQ section that usually troubleshoots any of the audio or visual that you may be having, but sounds like everyone can hear and see me, so that's great. This webinar will be recorded. We'll email it back out to you within 24 hours, and it will be available on this same link if you want to pass it around or listen to it and revisit again. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Tyler and kick things off.
Awesome. Thank you, Cassie. And thank you, everyone, for joining. Really excited to be joined by Christina and Sapita today to talk about building trust and governance policies with AI and AML. I actually believe this is the most critical point for adoption in the AML space. I actually think a lot of the functionality for AI is there to do a lot of automation, improve a lot of workflows, but it's really about building good policies around it and regulatory trust. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Christina for an intro and then Sapita after that, and we'll get into it.
Awesome. Thanks, Tyler. Thank you to the team in Unit 21 for having me. My name is Christina Ray. I'm a FinCrime compliance executive, licensed attorney, and I am the founder of Raycor Consulting, where we help fintech firms, crypto firms, and banks operationalize compliance in scalable and strategic ways. I am really passionate about AI governance. I've been in the process of developing some oversight frameworks and training programs for compliance and BSA officers. I'll talk about it more later, but I'm developing a new framework called AIR. It stands for AI Risk and Explainability. I think it's important that we can talk about AI and what it means to govern it without necessarily having a tech background. So thanks again. I will turn it over to Sapita.
Great, thank you. And I echo Christina's sentiments. Thank you to Unit 21 for inviting me to participate on this. I think, as Tyler pointed out, it's critically important to talk about the governance and the regulatory frameworks around AI. I'm Sapita Rowland, Senior Managing Director at FTI Consulting, and we help financial institutions of all sizes start to embrace and adopt AI. And it means different things to different people. We're going to talk a little bit about that. But this journey of transformation that organizations go through is so critically important. And excited to dive a little bit deeper into this topic and get into some of the best practices and what we've seen.
Amazing. Thank you both. And I'll give a quick intro of myself in Unit 21, and then we'll get into it. So I'm Tyler. I'm head of AI here at Unit 21. I've actually been here 6.5 years. I was the first hire way back when. So I was here before we had any clients at all. And yeah, so it's been a tremendous ride. And now I'm leading all things AI. So really passionate about this. I actually think it can really positively impact our whole industry. So I'm very excited about that. And then a little bit of background on Unit 21. Been around for about 7 years or so. Work with some of the top companies in the world, which very privileged to say that. And what do we think about what makes us different, and especially a little bit with an AI angle. So really, we want to put a lot of control and explainability into analysts' hands. So you'll see here like speed with control. This includes things like real-time interdiction, but giving analysts the tools to make adjustments to fight fraud and money laundering in real time. Explainability, which I think is huge. So each decision is audit logged and really easy to kind of show to a third party or even just other coworkers what AI is doing or what you've done as a human. And then automating with confidence. Again, this is really at the heart and soul of Unit 21, is allowing you to really see step by step every kind of automation we've taken. So, really excited for what we're building in the world of AI. And just a little, brief on that. What that looks like is Unit 21, you can build many different AI agents and assign them to different alerts. And essentially what we're seeing is a massive reduction in handle time. Now we're still focused on human in the loop. Yeah, you still have a human making a final decision, but it is still really exciting to see, a 20-minute alert go down to under, 5 minutes. So yeah, that's a little bit of preview Unit 21, but that's not the focus for today. So we'll get into it. I think the next thing we wanted to show, and I'll be done with slides for a second, is actually we have a couple poll questions here. Cassie, I don't know if you wanted to pull this up. Okay, great. So yeah, the first thing we wanted to do is if people could hop into the poll, it's really just 2 questions. Put in a vote, and then we'll give it maybe a minute and then go over the answers. And maybe to fill the silence, I'm curious, Christina or Sapita, if you have any immediate reactions on the results so far.
I think it's interesting. So far, we've got explainability and regulatory concern in the lead versus what I usually hear, which is job preservation of existing staff, which is certainly a concern. But I'm glad people are starting to think beyond that to explainability and concern, because I personally don't think that jobs are disappearing. I think they're just going to change, and the skill set for compliance staff is going to change.
That's absolutely right. I think we're going to start upskilling. We're going to change the skill set of, what we traditionally do. And as I've oftentimes thought about it, as an industry, we somehow have gotten comfortable with 95% false positives, and we say that's okay and that's understood and normal to expect. And I think this is kind of turning the page on that. And it's interesting. I think the poll is showing explainability, regulatory concerns, and then the accuracy and hallucinations. So, the risks that the model may present, and that's exactly the core of why we're here. So I'm glad. I think this poll validates, everything we're about to dive into.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting that I actually ran like a live poll of this at a conference for ACH Smarter Faster Payments a month or 2 ago. And the number one was regulatory concern. And actually lower on the list was accuracy and hallucination risk. So I'm curious how that changes with audiences. And as you mentioned, Christina, another top one was job preservation of existing staff, which doesn't seem to be an impact here. So it seems like really the top 3 of our budget, like proving ROI, hallucination risk, and regulatory concern, which I'd say, we're going to loosely cover all 3, but really the focus is going to be on explainability and regulatory concern today. Ooh, okay. Maybe Sapita, if you want to start on your reaction to this one.
Yeah, that's absolutely aligned with what I was saying, 95% false positives. So that's your level 1 alert reviews, right? That's where, when I was in a financial institution as a BSA officer, that's, you're spending a lot of budget, a lot of time, and a lot of man hours alleviating those level 1 alerts, the true false positives, the noise in the system. And so that's not surprising that's seems to be topping the charts here in the responses. And then we see case investigation support, right? So gathering all that information and kind of getting through a vast volume of data points to try to understand, is this suspicious? Is this not? Does this rise to the level of reporting? So that's an interesting result there as well. I think this aligns again with some of the comments we're going to make, but those seem to be the pain points that even when I was in industry, I've experienced. It's level 1 alerts, low hanging fruit.
Yeah, what are your thoughts, Christina?
Personally, from kind of a macro view, I agree with that, but I tend to see AI as I'm very, very pro AI. So I think AI can be helpful with a lot of this stuff. And specifically, it's not getting a lot of love right now, but oversight and audit prep. Hopefully we can talk a little bit more about that, because usually I think what people think of when they think of AI is, eliminating the false positives, a lot of stuff that's kind of encompassed in typical reg tech, but there's a lot more that it can do, and, utilizing it to help you govern, your AML program and do audit prep is incredibly useful, because when it gets time for exams, for audits, for reviews, for whatever, inevitably there's always things that you kind of forget about along the way. So utilizing AI to, kind of be your note taker, your compliance journal, as it were. I'm excited to talk more about that, as something that is, complementary to the rest of the use cases for which AI is super useful.
Yeah, I think both great points. For me, not shocked to see L1 alert review as the number one, given the volume. You mentioned 95% false positive rates. I do agree. That's quite high. And what we see on our side is you see demand across these, but of course, alert volumes compared to, say, case or filing volumes are just orders of magnitude different. So if you want to really save the most time, that level 1 alert review is a good place to start. The one place where I'm surprised that I actually do hear a lot is the model tuning and risk detection. It's kind of two sides of the same coin, right? Where you can either automate these alert reviews, or you can have better rules that have better false positive rates. So I'm surprised that's not as high, but definitely interesting to see that most folks are aligning to that L1 alert review. All right, so that is our poll. We're going to get into actually just the discussion. And before we get into any of the actual frameworks, what are the problems today? What do we think are the good solutions? And really excited to jump into that. We did want to start with a little bit of a crawl, walk, run plan for AI. So how do you think about it? How do you identify some use cases? Where do you even start? So this is a little bit answering that question of, how do you prove ROI a little bit? So I wanted to kick this to Sapita, because I know you've done this quite a few times. I'm curious your thoughts on guidance for folks overall that want to adopt AI in their AML programs but don't really know where to start.
Thanks, Tyler. I do advocate for the crawl, walk, run method, simply because I think the notion of moving from a rule-based system to fully AI deployed monitoring can be overwhelming. It's daunting. So, folks oftentimes say, I don't know where to start. Where do I slice and dice my data? How do I know what I'm building and where the focus needs to be? And so, my advice has always been start small. Start with, again, low-hanging fruit, the easy stuff that you're already doing today that you can layer AI over. You probably will start with some kind of a machine learning, robotic process automation, and then move from there into the mode of technically AI as we think about it today. I definitely discourage folks from saying, I'm going to scrap my TM models I have today and move totally into, an agentic AI type of situation where, all this data is going in and it's assessing and it's giving me output. That's not, I think, what we're talking about. We're not playing in the big leagues just yet. I think you got to start with T-ball at some point and say, let me start. Let me get a few at bats. Let me make sure that the model actually is developed properly, that I have enough data to ingest into the model, and that I understand what the output needs to be and the output aligns with that expectation. So certainly, if anybody out there in the audience today is overwhelmed by this notion and you're blinded by, where do I start? How big, how deep do I need to, build this out? Start small. Oftentimes you can start with, whether it's level 1 alerts, you can start with due diligence reviews, investigations, narrative building. Start small and make sure that you and your organization have an appetite for this. Because I think what we're then going to get into is AI is going to expose you to new risks that your organization and you, from a compliance perspective, have not cared for previously. So you want to make sure that when you start, you understand all of the new risk exposure elements and what that means to your organization. How do you, really build out a risk-based program in this new environment? So start small, understand what the goals are supposed to be, test against those goals, and make sure that you can achieve it before you then continue down this path. So that's always my, advocacy up front, is to say, start small, make sure the proof is in the pudding, and then you move forward from there.
Yeah, I think that's great. Do you have any thoughts on this, Christina?
I mean, I agree with Sapita. there's a lot of noise about AI in the space, but ultimately what it boils down to, usually with compliance officers is having to make a business case, for cost and, is this really necessary? So starting small, honing in on what are the immediate pain points, in terms of KPIs, what can we use to, really make this more efficient? How does this ultimately save us money in the long run? Which I think is really, the one of the siren songs of the compliance officer is how do we spend money to ultimately save money in the future? So I think Sampita made some really good points here about that.
Tyler,
Yeah.
the one other point I'll add on to that is when you do start small, and I know we'll echo this throughout our conversations, but bring your regulators, bring the examiners along on that journey, no matter how small your endeavor is. Make sure that they understand that you're about to embark on this AI journey and what that life cycle looks like, where you're focused on. Start to acclimate them to it, because oftentimes they may not be familiar with what that means and what the output should look like either. So I would definitely advise institutions to bring your examiners in early on that journey and keep them informed and involved, and ask for their feedback. Examiners who are engaged are oftentimes happy examiners. So keep them involved in that journey and make sure that they understand the components of what you're going through. And ultimately, you may decide not to ever deploy that AI tool either if you realize, based on testing, that it's not going to have the output result you want. And it's okay to share that information with your examiners and say, okay, maybe this model didn't work the way we intended it to be, but we're still furthering the AI experiences within our organization.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, to kind of echo these statements is I see it's kind of interesting. You get this almost like a panic of we need to adopt AI at every organization. But I do, really thoroughly believe, and especially in our space, that a crawl, walk, run plan where you identify the use case, what are the types of reviews you want to automate so you can, essentially reduce your risk exposure. And you can really measure success. Things just like, well, how many alerts can the AI review for us over what period of time? How many hours does that save for us? How much do those hours cost? So you can really, pitch this to the org internally of like the savings and ROI you'll get from that. And then I think another thing that, I really want to echo is having your success criteria laid out. What do we want as the output of these AI agents? And actually working with clients on deploying these agents, I think one of the bigger learnings for me is it actually helps folks kind of further document their SOPs, because sometimes it can be a little bit of vague of, hey, this is risky or not, and well, what makes it risky? And when you really break it down to those core steps, I think that overall helps your program and also helps the AI to be better, because it can really understand the actual steps you're taking in the review process. Now, to get into a little bit more of like the model governance, which might be one of the bigger blockers at your organization, a little bit less on the ROI side of things. This came up in the poll of, regulatory trust, and actually accuracy hallucinations. I think this also kind of covers that section. So, over 50% of people's concerns. So, really the first topic we want to focus on is, why does AI and AML feel like a black box, and why that's a problem? So, it's already being deployed today, either for people's personal use, through a vendor, through a, own internal solution. But unlike rules-based systems, models can feel opaque, especially if you're giving it a relatively vague task. So if you can't really clearly explain like why an alert was closed or escalated, why a decision was made, etc., the framework might feel shaky, and it's hard to really be defensible to auditors. And so, to get started on this topic, I wanted to ask you a question, Christina, of, really what is the difference between explainability and defensibility, and why does that matter in audits? And, with that, how is that related to AI, and what are the core AI risks?
Yeah, these are great questions, Tyler. So explainability and defensibility, they're related, but they are a little bit different, and it's important to understand the distinction. Explainability is really about understanding how the AI tool is making a decision. What data went into it, what patterns is it finding, why did it choose one outcome over another? That's critical for your day-to-day compliance, because if your team doesn't understand what the model is doing, and that's what we mean by the black box, it's hard to then trust it let alone intervene with it if something goes wrong. Defensibility, that's kind of what matters during an audit or an exam. That means being able to back that decision up with documentation, kind of like when you were in school and you had to show your work when you're doing math problems. So for example, what model version was used, what thresholds were set, who approved it, how was it monitored. I think, and this might change as time goes on, regulators at least now understand that not every model will be 100% explainable, especially in deep learning. I don't think anyone is expecting compliance officers to turn into, software engineers and data scientists overnight, but we still have to have guardrails, oversight, and testing that you've built around your AI models, because otherwise you're going to have a problem. And then you were talking about core AI risks, which I'm excited to get into. But really quick, I just want to kind of give everyone an overview, if you're not familiar, the difference between generative AI and agentic AI, because you're going to hear those terms tossed about quite a bit. A real easy way to distinguish the two is generative AI creates things while agentic AI acts. So generative AI are models that create new content like text, images, stuff you think about when you're using, Chat GPT. For a compliance officer, things like narrative generation, SAR summaries, for customer service, customer comms, things like that. Agentic AI are autonomous systems that are becoming increasingly more popular, and we're seeing a lot more use cases for those. They make decisions, they're autonomous, and they make decisions, trigger actions, and they can interact with other systems. So this is something like a system that will automatically close alerts or adjust risk scores. And there's different types of risks with both types of AI. So getting now into some of the core risks that you can, that are in all the various types of governance and guidance that we're going to talk about. The core risks that are out there, some were touched upon in the poll, some weren't. One is bias. So bias in AI refers to systemic and unfair discrimination that is embedded into the model's outputs due to skewed or incomplete or biased data that goes in. I mean, we've all kind of heard the, expression, you get out of it what you put into it. So bad data goes in, you're going to have bad outputs. So as a compliance risk, this can violate a number of different things. It can violate fair lending laws, anti-discrimination laws. It can trigger scrutiny under risk-based approach guidance. I'm in New York, so I deal with the DFS. So there's lots of bureaucracy here. It can run afoul of expectations for fairness and equitable treatment. So considering bias is important. Another core risk that's important to talk about is drift. Drift is what happens when changes in model behavior over time shift. They shift due to input data or the relationship between the input and the output. So for example, like an AI model that might have been trained on a particular set of data may begin producing different outputs during validations, and this can undermine predictability and performance guarantees. So like for, again, I try to tie it back to, fin crime compliance. A sanction screening model may become less accurate if geopolitical developments shift what constitutes suspicious behavior, but the model hasn't been retrained with those updated patterns. Another core risk is explainability gap. I just kind of went into the difference of explainability and defensibility. We need to understand what the rationale is behind a model's output. A gap occurs when decisions are made, but no one can explain why this is happening. So for example, like a transaction monitoring model flags a wire transfer due to an unseen latent pattern. But the analyst can't identify the reason or provide a clear explanation for why this is happening. Another one is hallucination, which we were talking about in the poll. That refers to the model generating plausible sounding but factually incorrect or misleading content. Someone gave a webinar on this a few months ago, and he kind of drilled it into us: trust but verify. So when you're using an AI model, generally speaking, what it produces, is helpful, but it's not always 100% factually accurate. And we need to, this is where we'll get more into this. This is where, having human in the loop validation, especially early on, during the Wild West days of AI, having that validation to catch these type of failures is actually critical.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, a ton of great points from, how do you want to define generative AI versus agentic AI? How are those risks different? Really the core thing is agentic AI is taking more actions. So your risk exposure is going to be higher. It's a little bit more powerful. And then to your point is the trust but verify I love, because everyone is, I'd say, kind of lazy naturally, right? If AI is giving you this great answer, and a lot of the times, it'll try to do something that you like, which might not be actually factually correct. And so, I think that is, very important to call out. I'm curious, Sapita, how do you think, what do you think about the risks for AI, and maybe how are these different, from working with a third-party vendor like Unit21, or, doing your own homegrown solution?
Yeah, I think you raised that great point earlier as well, Tyler. I think it's important for institutions who potentially say, I don't have an appetite to use AI, to realize that their third parties may be already there, that they've already embraced it and they have it embedded within the platform. So I would say, first and foremost, have the conversations with your third party providers to ensure, figure out whether or not they do have some level of AI already adopted into the platform that is being offered to your institution that you may not necessarily be aware of. So as we step back and think about model risk management, you may have a model as described, but you want to make sure that that model governance documentation also incorporates any third-party AI solutions that are being offered, that are on the platform that you may not be aware of. And I think the other point, to Christina's point of kind of that feedback loop, is make sure that, traditionally our model governance documentation talks about, potentially testing and tuning and calibrating systems and rules where you set the thresholds, you set, dollar amounts, time, whatever it may be, you're adjusting those levers. But this is a constant feedback loop into the AI model. You want to make sure that your model governance documentation cares for that feedback loop. How often does it happen? What kind of information is getting fed back? And then when there are discrepancies or the hallucinations Christina mentioned, how do you care for those moments? What happens? How do you discover them? What are the triggers? And then what happens when that information gets fed back? What's different in that feedback loop from the rest of the feedback loop? So I think all of those components are super important to make sure that you memorialize and document, which is different than the way we as bankers have done it in the past. So, make sure that that documentation is there, particularly then if you're running, maybe you're testing the AI platform and you're not, fully unplugging your existing TM and plugging in the new AI. Those are moments where you're going to have two model governance documentations. You're going to have your traditional model governance that talks about your existing TM program, and then you're going to have one that explains, any kind of layer on add-on that you have. But I think the key to all of this also, Tyler, is establish a good working relationship with your software providers. Make sure that you have ongoing conversations. Make sure that things aren't introduced into the platform that you as a financial institution are not aware of. I think that's so important. What I oftentimes see, and unfortunately, when we talk about, enforcement action moments, those are when institutions have incorporated a platform and it's kind of plug it in and forget it. Walk away from it. It's doing what it's doing. Yes, the alerts are high, but it's doing what it's doing. You want to stay involved, engaged with your providers and make sure that you understand what's on their strategic plan horizon, where they're headed, and particularly with AI. And if they don't have it in their strategy, ask them about it. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So I think that's critically important to make sure that you stay involved, engaged, and that you fully document and memorialize your model governance program around, anything that a third party is doing for you as well.
Yeah, it brings up the question, and I know you mentioned this. I think this is really interesting. Of you might need two frameworks in place, right? Because your traditional rules-based system, sometimes it can be a set and forget because it is relatively static, right? It is going to run these queries, it is going to produce these outputs consistently for the most part. With AI, of course, you have a lot more dynamic functionality, but you have that risk of a hallucination here and there. So there is a lot more tweaking, monitoring that needs to be put into place. So that actually brings me to a question for you, Christina, of, are today's policies enough for AI, or where do they fall short?
That is a great question. I will try to keep this brief because I fear I could take the remaining 30 minutes just talking about this. But, when it comes to risks, I think regulators generally have taken kind of a same risk, same rules approach. So when we're talking about governing AI at the moment, there's a lot of chat around model risk management. And model risk management is great because it provides some excellent frameworks and foundations, but are they enough on their own? No, they're not. So, for those unfamiliar, the legacy frameworks around model risk management are issued by the Federal Reserve and the OCC. They're called SR 11-7 and then OCC 2011 to 2012. They apply to financial institutions using quantitative models for decision making. They do things that we all know about, like model validation and performance monitoring. These frameworks assume that models are static and interpretable. They don't really address, they weren't built to address because it didn't exist then, the dynamic, the opaqueness, or the autonomy of today's AI. They assume that there's model stability, that your model isn't changing daily, that things like inputs and outputs can be mapped neatly, and a human can explain how it works. So we've been talking about a lot of this throughout. Sapita brought up, some terrific points around that. This falls apart when you're dealing with an evolving AI system that needs to constantly retrain on new data, generate responses dynamically. When we're talking about agentic AI, there's more autonomy going on. That certainly isn't a static model. So the traditional model risk management framework, it doesn't account for drift. With AI, you need continuous performance validation. A framework like SR 11-7 assumes your validation is a one-time exercise with light ongoing monitoring, like you guys were just talking about. Explainability is more limited in the traditional framework. It doesn't mandate that outputs be understandable to non-technical users, but this is where we're starting to blur the lines a little bit between compliance officer and data scientist. So far, we're at the point that, if you're in compliance, you need to be able to explain a decision. I firmly believe that if you're in compliance, your job isn't at risk, but your skill set definitely needs to be updated. So, I think the future for compliance teams that are using AI is to become more literate in in data and being able to explain what's going on in your models more substantially. I think the regulators will adopt the crawl, walk, run approach to start, but who knows where that will end up in a couple of years. And then another area that I think model risk management obviously doesn't really account for is bias controls. There's little guidance, in the traditional model risk management framework on how to assess or mitigate bias in, something like a large language model. And certainly, I mentioned before, these frameworks don't address autonomy. I don't know that agentic AI was really a concept when they were written. So these are all, components that newer guidance, which I'll get into, a little bit later, starts to address.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, and I think a core point of it is how it is so different than a traditional rules-based system. I don't know, Sapita, if you want to expand on that, and what are these core differences that you really have to account for? One of those key ones I often think about is it's not so static, right? It is dynamic, so more frequent validations are often warranted. But yeah, what are your thoughts?
It's interesting. I think Christina's absolutely right in that we need to upskill our staff and folks looking at alerts. And so, ensuring that not only as we think about model governance and putting the documentation together, that's all well and good. But I think there's another body of work where you need to retrain the team that's looking at these alerts. Not only retrain them on, potential money laundering, terrorist financing, whatever it may be, right? The typology aspect of it, But you also need to train them on the hallucinations that Christina mentioned and the drift. When these alerts just don't seem to make sense because the AI has incorporated data in a different way or has analyzed it in a different way, and you take a look at that output, you've got to train your analysts to be able to raise the flag at that point and say, time out, something went astray here, and we've got to take a look at this alert and figure out what happened. Both, as we like to think about it in the traditional TM process, above and below the line, right? You want to take a look at those alerts that maybe the AI didn't flag and said, no, these don't rise up to what your standards are and what you're looking for. You want to take a look at that and ensure that there is no drift, that there is no hallucination happening, or introduction of data points that should not have been incorporated. So I think you're thinking about it and you're training your staff in a different way than traditional, analysts that review alerts and investigate and dispose of alerts. Now they have to flag for, when are these alerts not correct and what does that look like? And who do I escalate it to? How do I address it? You've got to start to build some of those trigger moments that say, this is what I need you to alert me to, because then we understand that the model doesn't work. And I think that goes to a part of the explainability as well. It's not how well, the model works, but it's also, how do you identify moments when the model does not work as intended? And, what does that look like? You're going to have to document a lot of that to say, when there is drift, what is that? And how am I going to be aware of it? And then what do I do with the system once I recognize that? Obviously, like I said, the feedback loop will be different, but what do you do with those alerts that have now been generated? So I think you have to look at it from a different lens of, we're not in Kansas anymore. We're not doing the same thing. But what does that mean to us now in the new norm? And how do we define it? And how do we document it? And how do we build controls around it? Certainly, I think ultimately you need to have a process to sunset some of these, AI agents when either the agent isn't performing as expected or the utility of the agent has been exhausted. You no longer need that agent. So, it's a more dynamic environment than I think traditionally as a compliance officer we've been used to in the AML space.
Yeah, I completely agree. And one thing I wanted to talk about is, what has regulatory feedback been so far? We've demoed our solution to FinCEN, the Department of Innovation in California, and the main feedback we've gotten so far is kind of exactly what you all are saying. First is definitely bring them along, keep them in the loop. Given that this is new territory, it's not your static-based rules engine. Having things like a human in the loop policy is critical. What's your plan in place for when things do drift, meaning an AI has gone rogue? What does that mean for you? So that could be, your decisions on alerts has drastically changed. It could be that all of a sudden your alert volumes drastically change if your AI is alerting for you. So having these kind of measures in place with, plans for if this would happen, here's how would we address these alerts, I think is really critical. So really that's been kind of the main piece of feedback, alongside, of course, explainability, being able to show them and explain actually how you're doing things, what the AI is doing, what the human is doing, but having like a really good plan in place for when things get a little bit more autonomous, as well as keeping them in the loop rather than, trying to do it without, talking with your regulatory bodies. So yeah, any comments y'all want to make on regulatory feedback so far, Sapita or Christina?
I think, just everything that we've been saying so far, they're not going to be impressed if you say, the robot did it, and just kind of blame the black box. Just like any other, piece of tech that you're using, they're going to want to know how the models are being validated, monitored, and challenged, and then how you're documenting all of this. You mentioned California, Tyler. I'm in New York. I know New York, DFS is already starting to issue guidance around algorithmic decisioning. And a lot of principles overlap with some of the newer guidance that we're seeing on a global level around transparency, fairness, traceability, and human oversight. So I think, the smart decision here is to get ahead of this by adopting, some voluntary frameworks and starting to build this into your risk assessment. If you do have these models, you might even need your own AI risk assessment, if it doesn't kind of fit into your overarching compliance risk assessment at the moment.
Yeah, speaking of, go ahead, Sapita.
No, I agree with that. And I think the other part of explainability, Christina mentioned this earlier, it's worth emphasizing again. As a compliance officer, we don't need to be well versed on the technology side of things, right? And how the sausage is made, but more so, we've got to have internal stakeholders that we align with. And that's so important is build those relationships. Again, it's not set it and forget it. And it's not, I've delegated that to the tech team or my AI team, I know nothing about it. You've got to have a good, solid working knowledge of it, but it's also important to engage your internal stakeholders as well as your third party solution providers to make sure that you've got the right people in the room having those explainability conversations, and that you avoid the notion of saying to an examiner that it's a black box, the vendor doesn't tell me, they don't give me any documents, and all I know is they control it and they update it. That's not going to fly. And so I think that where I've seen success in the industry is that level of collaboration, where you bring your third party in, you bring your tech team, your AI team, and your examiners all along on the same journey, and you all learn from each other. Again, I think the dynamic of compliance is changing, and it's important for us as leaders to also stay on top of what's happening in the industry, and not just say, I'm relying on others, I'm outsourcing this, or I'm delegating the duties.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And that's something maybe I wanted to double click on, Sapita, is how do you effectively do this? Is it at your regular audits? Is it more of a quarterly sync? How do you think about interacting with regulators? Should everyone go send an email to their regulators now and set something up? Or yeah, what's your advice to everyone about how to effectively do this?
Well, certainly have a plan in place, right? If you say, as a leadership team, we have acknowledged, we've budgeted for, we're going to build out AI, that is the moment that you want to start to have the conversation. You don't want to, prematurely just reach out and say, I have this notion in my mind, I'm interested, everybody else is doing it, the bank down the road is doing it, so I'm going to start doing it. Those are not the moments of conversation. You want to actually have some kind of a plan, something that's more meaningful, where you can develop a strategy around it and say, this is our solution, here's what we're envisioning, and kind of start to walk them through that journey and the vision that you have. But also then at that point, you don't want to wait for an exam to happen. You don't want those surprise moments. Nobody likes to be surprised, examiners included. When they walk into your institution, they say, so what's changed since, 2-3 years ago when we were last in this institution? You say, well, let me tell you about all this terrific AI we've got going. We went from 100 people down to 5. That's not the moment that they want to experience. So make sure that you talk to them frequently. You can reach out to your examiner in charge, your examiners. You build a relationship. And, based on that relationship that you've established, you reach out to them on a, periodic basis, and you check in and you say, hey, this is what, the direction our institution is going in. And, I want to bring you in if you have time and walk you through some of this. I want to get your insight, your feedback. We do this with various different product services that organizations start to offer and expand on, or acquisitions that they do. I don't think this is any different. This is a slight change in your business model and your regulatory risk changes. So you want to bring them along on that journey. You don't want that surprise aha moment to happen.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. Is the more transparent you can be, the better it's going to be. It's really not a ask for forgiveness moment. Yeah, I want to emphasize that. And then getting into the actual frameworks, I know there's been a new framework coming out, Christina, that I think you'd be great to talk a little bit about, which is ISO 23894. Would you want to talk a little bit about that and how it can be used for AI, or any other frameworks you'd actually recommend folks to take a look at?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a bunch of guidance out there right now that's really helpful, and I'm going to toss a lot of acronyms out. And again, I'll try to be brief. So one that was just released in 2023, the ISO. So ISO stands for International Organization for Standardization. anyone in banking has probably heard of ISO standards coming out. This one is one of the first frameworks specifically getting into AI risk management. So to me, it's kind of like a sibling to another piece of guidance that is really useful, the NIST AI Risk Management Framework. This is issued by the US National Institute for Standards and Technology. They both apply to any organization deploying AI, and they're getting more into a lot of the core risks that we've been talking about. So where your model risk management frameworks, are good foundations to start to stand up, your model validation, and getting into understanding your models. These frameworks are getting into things like managing bias, explainability, data drift, all the core risks that we have been talking about. So the ISO standard brings kind of an international lens to AI risk management and a little bit more operational detail. So it reinforces the same principles as what we have in the US, the NIST, but it takes a little bit more of a global view, which is important because on a global scale, there are definitely jurisdictions that are a little bit ahead of us when it comes to regulations. EU, for example, has issued the first binding global AI law. And I think it's important for everyone to know about this, even though it was issued by the EU. I think it was finalized last year and it's being phased in throughout next year. It applies to anyone offering AI services in the EU, including US fintechs. So if you have business, in the EU, this will apply to you. And this will make it so that you actually have obligations under law to get into risk tiering, your AI. So they have very strict rules for high risk, AI uses like credit scoring and fraud detection. And, they have a framework for what you actually need to do. To me, it's kind of like, GDPR was the wake up call for privacy, in the EU. And then the US is trying to scramble to catch up to that. The EU AI Act is now doing the same for AI. So for anybody who, is adopting AI models or even considering it, or even just wants to learn more about, AI governance, looking to these frameworks, the NIST and the ISO are voluntary. The EU one is obviously not, but reading through them, sort of understanding where they're going with things like, managing these core risks, structuring your risk for different types of AI. This is all, incredibly, useful info. And then I'll just mention real quick, the FATF 2021 updated guidance on digital identity. This is one of the first global frameworks to explicitly address AI and machine learning in AML contexts. So when we're talking about AI, we're kind of talking about it from, a more general perspective. A lot of these frameworks, we're not made with, specifically fintechs doing, AML and sanctions in mind. But this guidance does specifically get into the use of machine learning in KYC, explainability and auditability in those types of systems, governance expectations. And they, in the FATF one specifically, emphasizes the need for, human in the loop oversight and transparency in decision making. So even though there's nothing quite binding yet, there is a lot of really good guidance out there and a lot of good resources. If you're starting to want to develop that, voluntary program I talked about before, your AI risk assessment, getting familiar with these frameworks is an excellent starting point.
Yeah, and then I guess, just to double click there, what's your next step after that, Christina? Is it kind of getting familiar with your frameworks and then creating your own model governance policy at your company, getting that reviewed by teams, getting alignment there? Or kind of what do you recommend as like the crawl walk plan for getting a little bit towards a place where you can try out AI, safely?
Yeah, I think crawl, walk, run, applies in a lot of contexts here. So, starting to understand some of the guidance that's out there and what's expected, understanding the risks that are native to AI is a great place to start. you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. Take a look through the documentation you have now. Certainly look through your risk assessment, tie everything back to your risk appetite statement. Make sure that this is, all aligned so that when regulators come, you're not kind of caught wrong-footed that, you had this overarching risk assessment, enterprise-wide risk assessment or AML risk assessment, and you're kind of jamming AI into there. So start small, see what might be applicable that you do have, and then kind of build out from there. If you're building it into your policy, the policy should, not necessarily need to be touched. But the rest, everything that we're talking about, the policy, the procedures, your frameworks, your risk assessments, that should be a little bit more modular, and make sure that you have version control around things. You have human checkpoint logs. As you start to develop this, think through what's different for AI, and think through above and beyond all, what controls do you have in place, and then what do you need to build out. And then from there, like any other kind of program, you can start adding on, do some more plug and play, and build out from there.
Yeah, something that you mentioned, and I'm curious if you want to follow up on this, Sapita, is a huge difference of AI is once it starts really automating things. What is your human in the loop policy? Which is almost a funny term to say, but yeah, what is your human controls, procedures? Do you want like a dual review? So a human takes a look at every alert review, verifies the AI output. What about when you scale things like random sampling, or doing a quality assurance, quality control check? What have you seen, and what do you recommend?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So you touched on a lot of great points, which is, I think Christina earlier mentioned, make sure to address this within your risk assessment. So that's one key element, but also quality assurance and quality control measures. So we often deploy those within our transaction monitoring systems. This is not unique, to just TM. So make sure that you layer on quality control. Again, both understanding if you have any kind of automation that goes ahead and does decisioning, which I have not yet fully seen, but if you have anything that auto closes on alerts, you want to test that piece. You want to make sure that you build quality control around that as well, so that you're testing what's not being escalated for further review, human in the loop, type of investigation. So that's very important. I think the other aspect, we talked about bias. I think it's really important to take a look at the output results with a diverse group of folks. And what I mean by that, you don't want one single analyst, two people, whatever, your team is composed of, to be the sole reviewers of that. You want to make sure that if there was bias in the feedback loop that happened, that you have a good cross population and a diverse team that you've assembled who takes a look at that and ensures that there is no bias coming out of any of that feedback loop result that you fed into it. So I think that's the biggest issue, at least that I've seen, is make sure that the output results are truly tested and are truly valid. If at any point there's discrepancies, again, we use all of these terms, hallucination, drift, whatever it may be, you want to have the ability to stop or revert back or undo what's been done, because what you don't want to do is then continually potentially be creating bias within a program that downstream you're filing SARs on, and you potentially may exit a customer based on that. So you want to understand the entire life cycle of how that alert is being engaged and interacted with, and what the results may trigger. You want to go back and be able to test that entire life cycle to make sure that the system is functioning the way it is. And just to add on to some of the advice that Christina gave, there's also OCC had issued a supervisory expectation document. I think it was back in 2022 on AI and AI governance. They do a great job of laying out the key components, the explainability factor, the data governance, data privacy issues. So I would advise folks to go back and review that and make sure that your framework aligns with, particularly if you're operating in the US, aligns with US regulatory expectations. I'm hopeful that, regulators will continue to issue guidance around this, seeing as how I think all of the federal agencies, as the heads of those agencies have changed in this administration, they've all echoed uniformly that they want AI adoption to happen and they want transformation to happen. So I'm hoping the agencies start to issue additional guidance, additional supervisory expectations around it.
Yeah, I think that's great. We have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to open it up for any Q&A. While we're doing that, I'm going to share my screen on some key resources for a follow-up. Anyone has any questions for Sapita or Christina or myself up here, more than happy to answer. So please jump in there, and then I will share my screen on some resources that might help you all. And actually, Christina has a resource as well that I think will be really impactful for everyone here. First, this is for Unit 21. If you want to try any sort of AI, this is a very easy, risk assessment. What this is doing is kind of a negative news, adverse media, OFAC check, just based on a name and other customer information. So what is their risk analysis based off of what we can search online? That's a great way just to try AI if you want to dip your toes. Maybe search your name and not your customer's name to start. We will be actually doing a more specific webinar on how to, in our Unit 21's product, deploy and build your own custom Unit 21 AI agents. This will come out next month, so really looking forward to that. Please join us for that if you're interested. And then the last one is we put together a buyer's kit. So this will walk through a lot of kind of the ROI questions. It'll cover a high level of model governance, et cetera, but really trying to empower buyers to take the next step in using AI and AML. And then, Christina, I did want to hand it to you. It's not in my slides, but I know it's in the resources section. If you click on the resources tab here, it's kind of at the bottom by profile. You'll see making the black box accountable, how compliance leaders can tame AI and stay ahead of the next frontier of risk. Christina, would you want to talk about that resource a little bit?
Sure. I just shared it in the chat as well, the link for it. And someone had asked a question about the guidance I was referring to, so I shared the link for that as well. Hopefully that's helpful. I'm really excited about this. I had the idea for this a little bit earlier this year when I was being asked about, AI governance. So I started diving into a lot of the frameworks that I've been talking about here. Some of them are blessedly short, some of them are quite long. But all the research that I was doing, I took and I wrote this white paper. So this is meant to be a practical guide for compliance officers, for compliance analysts, anyone in financial crime who's starting to see AI show up in their environment and doesn't have a lot of the clear oversight protocols we've been talking about today. The core message is effectively that AI is moving faster than our governance structures, and if we don't get ahead of it, we're going to be the ones trying to explain systems we didn't build, can't decode, and never approved. So the paper lays out a practical framework. It gets into a lot of the frameworks I discussed around, traditional model risk management, a lot of the newer frameworks, how to document and defend agentic AI that triggers actions and not just alerts, how to build explainability bias testing and human oversight directly into your program. From there, through my company, I've built out a product called AIR, which I mentioned at the beginning. It stands for AI Risk and Explainability. It's effectively a lightweight oversight framework for compliance teams who need to get ahead of AI governance that we've been discussing. It helps you map a lot of these decisions, build audit trails, and structure internal reviews. If you get a chance to download the paper, it's free. I'd love for you to check it out. And I would certainly love to hear any feedback, positive, negative, anyone has on this. And thank you to Unit 21 for the opportunity to share that. And I just, to continue plugging Unit 21, if anyone's in the New York area on August 13th, Unit 21 is having a risky business tour, and I will be talking about more practical tips for, implementing AI governance. So if you're around, come check it out because I will be there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Christina and Sapita. Really appreciate your time today. Thanks everyone for joining. As Cassie mentioned, we'll be sending out the recording. Please reach out with any questions. We're happy to share all these resources or follow up, get your questions answered. But yeah, thanks all so much. And clap, clap, clap. Have a great rest of the week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.